Well, good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this Fusion 21 webinar, Improving Performance in Procurement, a focus on contract management. Again, hopefully many of you will be familiar. I am Andrew Gray. I'm the Membership Relations Manager at Fusion21, and I'm delighted to be hosting and chairing this morning's session. Just before we start, again, I assume a lot of you will be familiar with the software by now, but just in case you're not, a few points of housekeeping. Firstly, if you want to minimize the panel, please click the orange arrow there, and that will minimize the panel for you so you can see more of the screen. Hopefully you're all hearing us well. But you can adjust the audio settings there, and again, if you're still having serious problems, quite often logging out and logging back in or turning settings off and on tends to do the trick. And then finally, and certainly most importantly, we do want you to participate as much as you can in this session, and you will see again on the panel, assuming you've not all minimized it, the question box, and please do fill in that and your questions, and again, please don't wait until the end. Please do fill in the questions as they occur to you as we go along. So again, important that we get your feedback and questions in that way. So in terms of just a very sort of brief introduction from me, contract management is clearly a very important part of the overall procurement process, and it's part of getting a successful procurement that continues in terms of how you then manage the contracts going forward. And again, I've taken a little bit of an extract from the government's green paper, Transforming Public Procurement, which again, I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And that has a whole chapter which is devoted to the issue of contract management. And again, as the slide suggests, it's really important that effective contract management is the key to successfully delivering a contract following the completion of a procurement exercise. So again, that ongoing focus on ensuring that you manage the process well is a key part. In terms of, again, another extract from this, and again, how the Green Paper seeks to recommend changes in what we're doing, is that ability to provide regular feedback to suppliers, so having effective KPIs, and in order to ensure that we continue to improve, innovate, and deliver value for money. And again, very much part of the ethos here at Fusion21 is that supply chain management and how we work with our suppliers to ensure that we manage the process, improve, innovate, and continue to deliver value for money. And then finally, again, as set out in the Green Paper, is the whole issue around performance data and feedback. Again, continuing to use data and to give that performance data and supply that information to suppliers to ensure that we have an effective contract management framework in place. So that's enough of me in terms of that very brief introduction, but I thought it was useful just to sort of set out the contents of what we're doing. And now, to some extent, the star of the show, as it were, delighted to introduce Andrew White, who's Head of Procurement at Onward. Andrew has been a contributor to a number of our procurement events, and again, in conversations with him, he was telling me about Onward's approach to contract management, and again, I thought it would make a really interesting session. So I'll stop now and hand over, and a big welcome to Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, you've got the pleasure of having two Andrews today, and we've got many of them at Onward, so it does get a little bit complicated, but let's keep this simple. And again, thank you very much for the invitation this morning, Andrew. It's definitely a pleasure. I really enjoyed the session earlier this year as well around the green paper, so hopefully this will complement that as well. So as Andrew's mentioned, my name's Andrew White. I'm the Head of Procurement for Onward. I've been here now for just over 2 years. And one of the things that we were really passionate about when the team was formed a couple of years ago is making sure that we took a bit more of a strategic drive around procurement. One of the key things that was identified quite early, and you'll hear this many, many times over in the public sector, is driving real value through contracts, and especially putting better practices in place and a better approach in place in terms of contract management. So one of the things that we embarked on early last year is to develop a new procurement strategy that focused on one of the themes around contract and supplier management. But at the time, we'd actually just hit the pandemic as well. So as most organisations would have faced huge issues around business continuity, pressures with contractors at the time in managing those relationships, but also ensuring they're still getting the value out of them. And one of the key things that we wanted to do around that is not only focus on that within our strategy, but to take a bit of a step back and say, people have done this to death many times before. It was in the National Procurement Strategy a few years ago, but actually, what is it we need to focus on? And I'll touch on some of the key steps that we've embarked on over the past 12 months and some of the practices that we're starting to embed now across Onward. But one of the key things that we wanted to do, as I've mentioned earlier, is to develop an approach. So rather than putting loads of practices and procedures in place and guidance, we wanted to try and instill a bit of a culture within Onward in terms of how we deal with governance, how we deal with management of risks, and how we take that strategic approach by using our resources in a better way. Performance management is a key driver in that. And what we've tried to do is separate contract administration from real contract management. And some of those objectives we'll touch on this morning, and hopefully that will come across in a clear and coherent manner. So one of the key things that we wanted to do from the outset is to emphasise to a lot of parts of the organisation that what we're talking about isn't just once the contract started. We go all the way back to the beginning of the procurement cycle, or once we've started to identify any need, and it start to identify at that point what the clear objectives are. We'll run through a couple of examples as well in terms of setting evaluation criteria, bringing the right skill sets together. But ultimately, that was the one key thing that we'd acknowledged a lot of contracts across Onward didn't necessarily accurately reflected. So when we went back to the key objectives, when we had a few issues, that wasn't necessarily being carried forward once the contract was being managed. And again, one of the key points that really led to that was we've got a really good pool set of external resource and expertise, but is that being used to best effect? So again, that's one thing we'll touch on this morning. I'll explain some of the steps that we're taking Onward to try and improve that. One of the key things around setting those clear objectives, and again, this is something we've reviewed quite a few times internally, just to ensure that those objectives are carried forward and how that is actually influencing the supplier relationship. Not only the selection of the supplier through a procurement, but also how we manage that supplier. Countless times I've had conversations with people around stationary suppliers, and apologise if any of them are on the call. Ultimately, we might be spending 5,000 or 6,000 a year, and yet there's still a huge emphasis of managing that relationship, managing the value that we're getting out of it, and actually that time can be spent better elsewhere with some of our higher risk, higher impact contracts. So one of the things we have talked about is what is the oversight we do have on our contracts, and how do we focus our resources and manage those relationships more effectively. And then the last part as well, which was really key for us, is every contract, as Andrew's just mentioned, is there to achieve value. And for us to play a part in that, in realising that value, well, in a lot of cases, the contract is that let and forget philosophy. As long as the day-to-day activities are being done, the services are being delivered, those wider aspects around social value and all the other added value that the contract is there to deliver is often forgotten. And that is one of the key things that we've said, let's start off with the basics, but let's not forget that broader value that each contractor said it's going to deliver and the part that we need to play to support them in delivering that. Next slide, please, Andrew. So I've just reflected on some of our objectives, which again follow the themes from the first slide, and some of the things that you'll probably have some concerns or challenges around. And again, we'd like to encourage some questions around this. A lot of this does emphasize around culture. So culture of the organization and culture of the supplier. And again, those are really key, because ultimately by embedding better practices and procedures, you need to mirror that with the culture of the organization to get that support. And a lot of it, again, which has come from some of the challenges from the green paper, a lot of procurement professionals like myself have been crying out for some better practices around contract management for many years. And some of the implications around some of the changes will put more emphasis on that, but again, will likely impact on capacity. So again, these are some of the things that, again, just have a think about. There's a bit of a common theme across this anyway. And then last but not least, skill sets and resources. So again, just as we go through some of this, any questions that might come about that are raised to Andrew, we'll pick up as we go along. But in terms of some of those key objectives, again, what we wanted to do is address what the current challenges were. And some of these have pre-existed within public and possibly private sector for many years. And again, there's a very heavy focus on contract administration. You speak to any construction professional, any professional that's managed contracts for many, many years, and they will give you chapter and verse about how to administer the contract. However, what the key challenges that we were experiencing were when we came across a problem. So some of that can be dealt with by working with a contractor, or others, it's more about, have we been prescriptive within the contract, and how have we set up the right skill sets to manage that supplier relationship? So one of the key things around performance and risk management was, have we got that oversight? Are we set up to manage that and take action where necessary? And have we got the right skill sets across the organisation supporting those contracts? So again, we took a bit of time to reflect on that, and that's something that we'll talk about shortly. As I've just mentioned around oversight, one of the key things we wanted to have at Onward is that overview of all of our contracts. So whilst we will provide a lot of support to our high value, high impact contracts and probably focus our time and attention around those, it's great to have oversight on how our contracts in general are performing. And ultimately, we had a lot of pockets within the organisation that had some really good methods and practices, great performance data, great outcomes being delivered, but it wasn't consistent. And again, that's probably applied across many different organisations. So some of the approach that we've taken is, how do we start to embed that culture, and how do we start to get consistency? So one of the things that we did around that is to understand the resources across the organisation, get a little bit more of a formal structure. So in terms of support services from procurement, finance, legal, health and safety, we've all got a common goal and objective here, but we do need to work together. So one of the key things there is, we looked at the decision making and how performance and risk is being managed, and then brought those parts of the organisation together to focus on where our key objectives could actually lead us to. And that really led us to the structure. So ultimately, not everything is going to be the same, and ultimately we can't deal with everything. But if we have a little bit of a structure together to see how we can deal with some of these contract management issues, then that allows us to provide a bit more consistency in the approach. So where I've mentioned around bringing support services on board, we're starting to create almost a virtual team across different areas of the business. Some of you might be familiar with business partnering models across different organisations. So it's to focus our resources across those support services to actually help develop contract management across the organisation. That allows that single point of contact for each of those support services. They become more familiar around the contracts, and they can help shape how the contract is also going to be managed through that early stages of that procurement. And again, that's just managing our resources in a little bit of a better way and focusing them on the right areas of the business. Thanks, Andrew. Next slide, please. So just to break it down, we've got a contract management framework up and running now. We have still got a few practices and measures to embed to make sure that it's going to be fully taken to effect. But just to give a bit of an oversight at this stage on how we've actually structured that to keep things simple, create awareness and provide a bit of structure, just so that when we do roll out more practical methods and support, people are clear on what areas are going to have the biggest impact. So the one thing that we focused on, and again, this is coming back to the basics, is whilst we have many contracts in existence now, some are working really well, some need to improve. The one thing that we wanted to influence more than anything is actually how do we embed better practices in a contract by doing some more preparation work. So a lot of procurement professionals on this call, we've consulted with a lot of people within the organisation and across different organisations. And the one thing that we felt was probably missing in terms of that early preparation is engagement from the team, but also those wider support services as part of that planning. So again, part of the organisational delivery is to assess the importance and impact of each contract. That might determine who needs to be involved and also the approach to contract management. And again, some of those early conversations that we've had, I would say this year, have completely radically changed who will then be involved in the procurement, but also the management of the contract. And we'll come on to that mobilisation aspect as well in a moment, because that's again a key critical factor. But one of the key aspects at that stage is to get the right expertise involved to not only do the risk assessment, which will then help with selecting the right contract, but whilst we do have many standard templates and forms of contract, it's actually what do we need to influence at that stage that's going to help us manage the contract more effectively. Some of that comes back to roles and responsibilities. So what we've tried to embed recently at the outset of every procurement is to identify the impact and reward of that contract. So some of it might be there's new social value opportunities to be delivered within a particular area of the community. So actually we need to bring our social investment team in at that stage to have some of those conversations. There might be huge impacts on that contract in terms of delivery for our customers. If the supplier fails, we're accountable, so therefore we're responsible and we fail. So therefore, members of the legal team, members of the department that manage risk need to be brought in at that stage to help shape the way that the contract's going to be selected and the way that the supplier relationship is actually managed. So again, a lot of emphasis has been put on that particular stage, which I'll talk through in a bit more detail in a moment. And ultimately that is again to help change a bit of the culture and understanding of contract management so we can influence things at the outset and not just wait until the contract has been awarded. The bit that I'll talk through shortly as well is around selection of the supplier. And I won't go into detail around the procurement aspect, but more about some of the things we've talked about around preparation and how we can actually assess and look at the type of organisation we want to appoint. So it's not just purely quality and price driven, it's around those relationships as well. We had, again, a bit of an internal review around governance and approvals, which does tie into that. And I think one of the key things from our side is to have that oversight once the contracts are in place on how things are changing. So again, we'll talk about the management of the contract later on in this session, but one of the key things is to set out at the outset how things are going to be managed, relevant governance that needs to be put in place. And I know this is something that's come out from the green paper around contract changes, but again, we had quite a robust mechanism in place, but probably not understood very well across the organisation. And one of the key things that leads on to that is once we get to that contractor engagement piece is to make sure there's continuity. So the team that's ultimately selected that contractor, there needs to be continuity to ensure that management is effectively undertaken. Otherwise, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect. And the last part of this whole exercise has been then obviously getting things right as much as we can do along that selection process, and then making sure the right practices are put in place and the right resources are there to manage that contract. Easier said than done. That let and forget philosophy is still around, and ultimately a lot of it does boil down to resource and capacity. But from one of our points of view, when we've looked at performance management, there's a huge emphasis on performance indicators, but not necessarily around how the contractor is going to be managed, how we're going to embed supplier relationship management to ensure we support the contractor in delivering those outcomes, and making sure there's continuity with the contract. So if we do have problems, is it clearly laid out? Are there remedies? Are there escalation procedures? And who takes responsibility for those? When we talk about measuring benefits and outcomes, that often gets put to the back of the pile if a contractor's not quite performing. But again, it's really key for all of us to understand that actually by putting a lot of the mechanisms in place up front for the preparation of the contract and keeping those things in terms of objectives at the forefront of the work that we do enables us to carry on measuring the benefits of those contracts and making sure that the resources are aligned to that as well, because there will be other areas of expertise within each organisation that can take an active lead. And the last part, which I'm going to emphasise again right at the end of this session, is always prepare for the unexpected. Bit of an obvious quandary there, but ultimately risk management is a huge aspect of what we've been working on over the past 12 months. And having those ongoing due diligence exercises around finance, health and safety, what's going on in the marketplace, we've identified to look at our top 20% of our contracts. A lot of that has come from what the impact from the pandemic, but ultimately a lot of the contracts we're putting in place now will have a focused exit strategy, of which we are communicating with our contractors, and a lot of it is to also support them in the time of need. Thanks, Andrew. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to focus on a few slides around what we're doing around preparation. Now, on the right, it's just snippets from our contract management framework, but what I'll do is I'll just focus on some of the key activities and the development of the approach that we're trying to embed at the moment. So, as I mentioned right at the outset, one key fundamental aspect, and I know it's easier said than done, is to be clear on who is responsible for setting the objectives of the contract. Ultimately, when you bring a team together, often that gets a little bit lost in translation. There will be, a perception that we're going to continue with what we've always had, and it's just around selecting another supplier, going through a tender process. But ultimately, the one thing we've tried to encourage is to go back to basics, understand what the objectives of the service is, and ultimately reflect what's changing in the market and the organisation. So what is it we're actually wanting to deliver? Now, not only will that start to, affect the procurement strategy, the way we assess suppliers, we can reflect on the culture of the organisation that we want to bring in, but ultimately, it's around the importance. What is it that's so important of that contract? It might be customer satisfaction. So the cost might not be a factor, but ultimately the quality of the service and the way that our customers perceive that service might be a fundamental factor. And again, it's really key that the people that are brought in to help influence and how we shape that are identified from the outset. One of the key things that we've discussed is market knowledge. Ultimately, because everybody's running at 1,000,000 miles an hour, again, the rhetoric is we put out what we've always got to market. But ultimately, because the market's changing in such a fast-paced environment at the moment, have we got sufficient knowledge in the market to then identify some of these key objectives? And again, that's something that we've tried to address through the work we've done on category management quite recently. And again, it has changed our approach in quite a few occasions and how we select that supplier. And again, identifying those key objectives, I would always say right from the outset, it may change over time. And it might change once you've actually undertaken some market engagement and once you've gone through some additional due diligence. But getting the right people involved will ultimately reflect on how you change that strategy and how you select those suppliers. We've noticed a huge difference where we've implemented it, and it's been quite a challenging exercise where things have changed over a period of time and you've had a bit of conflict between these objectives, but it does influence quite a lot and it has had some positive impact. Next slide, please, Andrew. So moving on from the objectives, and again, they can be very broad and sometimes can be quite unique in some areas. One of the key things that is often lost right from the outset is identifying the right skill sets. Some of that might be around managing the technical side of a contract. Some of it might be because it's quite a litigious market. So again, having the right expertise within the legal department being brought in. Procurement is always number one in terms of bringing that expertise in, which I appreciate not all organisations have got a robust or a big capacity within their procurement team. So I do appreciate that can be a challenge. But there are various services across the organisation that should be consulted from the outset once that skill set's been identified. So the question should always be raised, how do you engage with those services? We had to reflect back on how we did it. We've tried to take a far more proactive approach, and we've set up oversight groups within the organisation that manage the procurement plan and look at changes within each department so we can try and get ahead of the curve. It's not a perfect science at the moment, and there will always be exceptions because, again, we move in a fast-paced industry. But again, what we've tried to reflect on is how do we, within the procurement team, make it easier for colleagues to identify who they need to consult with, what are the type of skill sets and how they identify them to select the right contractor and relationship, and also manage that contract. So there's clarity from the outset. One of the key things we've always said is, there's pockets of good practice within every organisation, but we need to look at how we can get consistency and how we work better together. So again, we've tried to focus on key areas of the business that are going to have the biggest impact. By changing that approach and that culture, hopefully over time that will reflect on other areas of the business. And again, it's how we've started to manage that capacity and resource, which has been a huge factor on the way that we've delivered things so far. And another key thing which we've discussed this year, especially now that the majority of people are still agile working and working from home, is how do we start to improve communications? How do we set a communication plan out from the outset? How do we manage communications across different teams so we're not duplicating effort? It's easy to lose things in translations from a Microsoft Teams meeting when you're not meeting on a regular basis. And again, it's how we manage some of those expectations across different departments. That's been a huge challenge. And I think having teams on board since early last year has definitely helped, but I think there are still some improvements that we need to consider. And again, that is something that we're looking at the moment. Next slide, please, Andrew. So contract development, and again, I would say one of our key challenges when we've been working at things within Onward is the perception that if we have a standard form of contract, it's perfect for everything. One of the key things that we've tried to introduce is an early assessment on risk, bringing in the right resource. So where we've mentioned before about those skill sets, about bringing that team together, even if it's just for an induction meeting, just to undertake a risk assessment and then look at what options are available. And again, we've got various standard forms of contract. There's the industry standard forms of contract that you will all be aware of across different industries. But ultimately, by having that risk assessment up front and understanding where the risk lies and the potential impact will then affect how we start to amend contracts up front and how we actually have that discussions with suppliers as part of pre-market engagement. We've tried to introduce that on a few occasions, especially with smaller businesses that will obviously sign up to anything until we award the contract. And then all of a sudden it becomes a bit of a protracted exercise. And in a lot of cases, they're not familiar with what they're signing up to. So whilst we are still developing our standard forms, we are engaging a lot earlier to have those discussions. And again, a lot of challenges we've had back from different departments is we haven't got time to read the extensive terms and conditions. We haven't got the time to do this. And there's still a bit of a reactive nature. But what we've tried to emphasize is focus on key aspects. So the risk assessment will determine which aspects of the contract are probably more important. Things around remedies, things around escalation, things around performance. And again, what we've tried to do at that early stage is focus on those key areas and try to influence that through discussions with the contractors as well. And again, that often then leads on to, if there are significant risks relating to a contract and it just happens to be that nothing's happened in the past, always consider a contingency plan. One of the things that we started doing within Onward early last year at the height of the pandemic is actually where are our key risks in terms of impact to our customers, impact to the supply chain because of everything that was happening, and what is our plan B. In some instances, we had quite a robust plan. In other areas, it hadn't been a key focus, and because of the changes in the marketplace, the risk had increased quite significantly. So what we're saying at the moment is let's have that discussion at the outset. Once we've done the risk assessment, what would a contingency plan look like? And it's really key there, and we'll come on to the exit strategy later, to start to consider key inputs to that exit strategy. Who manages the risk? Are people clear about what we need to do and when? And are the right resources engaged? Because bringing them in once something happens is often one of the worst things that you can do, because it's then just so much of a reactive nature, things just go pie-shaped. So again, some of the early conversations that we're having at the moment is how do we start to shape that that's appropriate for each contract? Thanks, Andrew. I'm just wondering at this stage whether or not there's any particular questions, because as I'm moving on to supply selection or mobilisation, I'm just wondering if there's anything that anybody wants to reflect back on so far.
Excuse me. There's not any specific questions yet, so encouragement to do that. But I sort of perhaps could just sort of lead one, which is around, you were talking about the sort of setting of objectives and how you've started to change that approach, trying to get that sort of market knowledge. And I suppose it resonated with me in terms of, I mean, clearly from a Fusion21 perspective, that's something that we're really keen on. But if you're an organization with, we know of some that there's only a couple in their procurement team, how do you try and get that sort of knowledge within the organization? I just wonder if there were sort of few more tips around that changing the sort of culture, but within a recognition of those scarce resources.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on, Andrew, and that was one of my key concerns. I know when the green paper came out, it was very much welcomed, but ultimately it's okay, how do we react to that? And depending upon the culture of the organisation and support, how can that knowledge be transferred? So one of the key things that we've discussed is we're fortunate we've already set up oversight groups across the organisation. They're focused on each directorate. We've got different challenges in each directorate. Some directorates are very much in tune with this way of working and have been doing it for years. They just need some support and advice and guidance. Other parts of the directorates aren't. So they will happily understand the service very well, but changing that approach and passing on some of that knowledge and benefits has been a key challenge. So what we've tried to do is, again, we've started off with the key contracts that we feel could have a positive impact, and bringing the right people into those oversight groups and just going through some general awareness and training. So the key objective setting, more often than not, they're already doing it. They'll be drafting a business case that needs to go to their exec team member or SLT member, but ultimately it's understanding the importance of those objectives through the procurement and also the management of the contract. So what we've done is we've brought real life examples to the table to say, right, we've reviewed a contract that you've currently got concerns with. When we've revisited those key objectives, what hadn't been done is the supplier hadn't been selected on that basis. The assessment criteria that have been introduced didn't even reflect on any of those, but it still seemed to be a key objective for that service. So why hadn't that happened? And a lot of it had been oversight. So what we tried to do is run through those examples and then put them into practice. So we'd identified a few key areas. Once those new contracts needed procuring, my team came in to support those at that outset to help shape the business case. And that's ultimately how we started to change the culture. And it's almost then that passing the knowledge on so they get that understanding and benefit.
And do you think, again, just picking up on that sort of culture thing, to two bits, and then there is actually a specific question, which is then around, has the organisation recognised the importance that procurement has in shaping that? Again, quite often procurement departments are seen as the baddies in all of this. And then again, in terms of this review, has it led to an increase in resources within your team as a result of the organisation recognising the importance of procurement? And again, somebody's specifically asked a question about how many procurement staff do you have?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, I appreciate it's going to be one of the biggest challenges that a lot of people on this call do have. We're quite fortunate at the moment that we've got half a dozen in the procurement team. We do operate category management, so we're very much in tune with what happens within each directorate. We're again very fortunate that the culture of the organisation, from the board to our exec, has seen the benefits already over the past few years from what the procurement team can provide, whether that be advice, knowledge, or actual application. So we've even run through some exercises with the board, and the feedback from them has been it's delivered exactly what you said it would. So again, the proof has been in the pudding. It's been great in terms of that message being passed out. And what we're finding now is we're trying to balance between still supporting existing contracts with our knowledge and expertise, But because we're bringing in other parts of the business, such as legal, health and safety, and that's having a positive impact as well, we're also seen as a bit more of a collaborative service rather than, as you mentioned, Andrew, the stereotype of compliance police, which tends to be branded with procurement. It does take time, and it does take a lot of investment in resource. But what I would advise is start where we can in the areas that are a bit more of a quick win. So those that are already probably engaged with the procurement team, that you can identify, some positive impact. And then I'm again quite fortunate that our exec director is very much in tune with what we're trying to deliver. So those conversations at a senior level, getting that buy-in. So our challenge is maybe mainly around delivery. And again, demonstrating the outcomes and the benefits is something that's really crucial as well.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant.
Right. Okay. Well, I'll move on to obviously this slide. So what I wanted to reflect on at the moment is, again, we've covered a lot of the initial preparation, and again, appreciate there's a lot more to it than what we've covered, but again, just some of the key points there. Again, once those clear objectives and the right people have been engaged to help influence how a contract should be managed, once it's been in place, that can often, dictate the procurement strategy. So not only on how we're going out to market, but the market we're intending to engage in, because again, the culture and the ethos of that supplier is then very, very important. The amount of times I've come in early doors to review how a procurement's being developed, only to find out that actually the number one priority is we want customer service to be absolutely paramount for our tenants because of satisfaction that's happened in the past. And yet the focus has been driven on driving costs down and time. So again, often looking back on those key objectives can reflect and change that procurement strategy. But then when we start talking about engaging with the right market and going through a tender, ultimately that evaluation criteria becomes even more critical. Again, we've gone through a few, I would say, more strategic delivery contracts over the past 12 or 18 months, where contract management and supplier relationship management as an assessment criteria on its own right has been paramount. And what we've done is we've reflected on the challenges that the technical clients had in the past with the contract, with the supplier, and we focused quite heavily on getting them to say, look, what is it that you've had issues with before? How have the supplier reacted to that? And we've had a whole session to say, right, let's go through that. That should then be reflected on who we're engaging, but more importantly, the assessment criteria and the development of the contract, because ultimately it's not only those two that can start to draw out the benefits of that procurement exercise. And one thing that we've learned from that is it's opening up an entirely different mindset. We led on something last year around our new unified comms platform, so telephony and contact center. And because of this approach, a lot of the challenges that they'd had in the past, and a lot of it was down to the relationship, actually, we've managed to deliver on that over the past 12 months. That became a key focal point within the actual tender itself. And we've got a contract and a supplier and that relationship to mirror that. So again, it's been another successful exercise. Once we've gone through that, the people that are actually involved have passed on that knowledge transfer, and they're starting to understand that approach, and it becomes a lot easier to influence that in the future. And the last point around this really is ensuring continuity from the procurement through to managing the contract, because again, the stereotype is procurement's only dealing with the tender. Ultimately, when the contract's let, it's back over to the client side. In a lot of instances, that's right, but within our profession, we technically do get involved in everything. I think what's really keen is if people manage to influence how the contract is shaped, how the supplier should be managed and who should be managing it, a lot of those resources that are involved from the outset are also then carried forward to managing the contract, and that continuity is key. Otherwise, there's a bit of a gap between, well, we weren't involved, why hadn't you done this? And actually, did you realise that you've missed this out? And this could be a fundamental issue in managing that contract. So again, I'll touch on that in a moment, but that's something that was really key and fundamental, that people understand the risks and the benefits of that as well.
Andrew, I'm just sorry. I'm just going to interrupt with a question, which is again to some extent what you've just touched on, and back to that sort of issue of culture. Do you think this is a public sector problem? Again, one of our audience has asked. They used to work in the private sector. They now work for a local authority, and for them, the things that you talked about were very much the ethos of procurement in the private sector. So is it a public sector thing?
I'd say from my experience, it could well be. I would say it's predominantly, having not worked much in the private sector, but working with private sector colleagues, I would say that probably reflects back on that. I've been in the public sector now for just over 20 years and in procurement just shy of that, probably about 17 or 18 years. And I think, again, the stereotype is the focus is on compliance. Public contract regulations, are we compliant? How can we provide support to other clients within the organisation rather than taking a far more active lead, because it comes back to resources. Some organisations might not necessarily see the full value of having a robust procurement team and everything else around it. In other areas, it's coming back to the stereotype because they only see it as compliance. Actually, when we do get involved in some of the other activities and demonstrate value, it's like, oh, never knew you did that. So again, I think a lot of those issues do evolve around the public sector, and despite interventions from government and regional centres of excellence and everything else, I still think that stigma is still there. So I think a lot of it comes back to influencing key stakeholders within that organisation, from board level, exec level, getting the right people supporting it, and then literally identifying key areas that you can influence and demonstrate that value. And I think that's one of the key things that we've done at the moment.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's all right, Andrew, it's a valid point, thank you. So again, just a bit of a continuation of what we've just talked about. One of the key things, again, coming back to that distinguishment between contract administration and performance management, which again is a skill set in its entirety. Because of the lack of continuity, a lot of contracts that have been put in place, and this is probably echoed across the public sector, don't necessarily reflect on what should be happening. So again, performance indicators might be put into a contract and they might be performing, but ultimately there are other areas that they're not performing in that are crucial to the delivery of the contract. So again, having that continuity of the right resource that should be identified these things up front is absolutely fundamental. Once you've entered into a contract, it's very difficult to make changes that actually is going to benefit one party and not necessarily the other. And again, coming back to those objectives, which I can't stress enough, ultimately those key objectives should help influence a lot of the mechanisms that should be management of a contract. Very often I'll get people coming to me for advice and they'll say, we're not sure what it says in the contract, but they're not doing these things here. And I look back at the contract and I look back at the objectives and I'll say, well, all those other things are incidental. If they don't do it, is it impacting on the contract? Well, not really, but it's really bugging me. And I said, well, the other key areas are really fundamental. And actually, having a look at your performance indicators, they're not actually delivering on those. What's the impact on that? Well, it's driving customer satisfaction down. So we'll focus on those first. And again, I think that skill set doesn't necessarily exist everywhere in the public sector, but there will be people within each organisation that can advise and support. And I think the next point I've raised there is, right from the outset, the one thing we've tried to influence is to distinguish between actually what are those key performance indicators. If a contract's got 30 or 40, I've got real concerns, because ultimately I can't see that many being needed on a contract that might be delivering X service and might just need 4, because if any of those 4 aren't delivered, it's going to impact on the contract. The other things, again, might just be incidental. So what we've tried to distinguish between what are the fundamentals of the contract, so if they don't perform, where do your remedies coming, because it's going to have an impact on the contract, and other information that actually supports that. So again, management information. What is it that's driving those KPIs that we need oversight of, so that if anything's going wrong, we can prevent it. So again, that's something that we've reviewed across Onward, and again, there is a lot of inconsistency there, but again, easy mechanisms to fix that, and that's something we're working on. And again, often you'll hear the contractor's not performing. They're not doing this, they're not doing that. It's their responsibility. Well, from my point of view, if people have entered into a collaborative relationship, both parties are responsible. So it's what support is the client providing to the contractor. And yes, don't get me wrong, there will be a boundary which you don't want to cross, otherwise it's going to cost you time, effort, money. But ultimately, that's what the remedies are there for. So clear remedies in a contract should give you a step-by-step guide on how you address poor performance. Start off with support, but ultimately there needs to be a fine line of which you don't cross. One of the key issues that I know a lot of organisations face is we've had poor performance for many years, we've run a new procurement exercise, the same contractor is about to be awarded the contract, or we've let them through. How do we rely on past performance? Well, if people haven't followed the mechanisms of the contract and clearly articulated what they will do in terms of termination, it's very difficult because they've ultimately accepted poor performance by not acting on it. And a lot of those issues still exist in the public sector. And to be honest, it's good commercial acumen to follow those. At the end of the day, if the contractor's not performing and you're doing all you can to support them, that's what the remedies are for. And that's something we're still fighting for at the moment within Onward to get that consistency. Next slide, please, Andrew. And I think this is one of the last ones. So in terms of exit strategy, and again, it's a term that's thrown about many occasions. I've had conversations with people and they think it's this huge thing that's going to take loads of time and effort. Ultimately, it's something that really will depend on the risk. So that risk assessment I mentioned at the outset, and that could just be a 5-minute conversation. What is the impact if the contractor cannot continue to perform? If they go into administration, if they don't turn up, all these aspects. Have you got somebody lined up on the doorstep that could literally come in? Is the marketplace fluctuating with these types of suppliers? All of these key things we start to ask now. And that will then influence what we do in terms of the contract, the relationship, and an exit strategy. If that is pretty much built up from day one and the right people are involved and assess that, it becomes a lot easier to invoke it when something happens. Years ago, when Carillion went into administration and all sorts of other types of organisations, the one thing that a lot of professionals asked is, who should be carrying the risk? What is the exit strategy? Irrespective of, did you know this was going to happen? And what are you going to do next? And all those key questions were being asked. 9 times out of 10, irrespective of people not being aware that it was going to happen, there was no contingency. And ultimately, a lot of that can easily be planned in so that when something happens, you can trigger it and the right people are involved. So again, very important for everyone to know what the plan B is. Even if it's just written on the back of a fag packet, it can be as simple as that. From our point of view, we've started to prioritise our high-risk contracts and then focus our resources around that. It's going to have a high impact. We've talked about capacity, start to focus on those first. One of the key things that, again, has come out from a lot of seminars people have attended around managing risk, the impacts from certain organisations going into administration is identify who is best to manage the risk. Either the contractor might be, or the organisation might be, or it might be someone within the organisation that needs to play an active role. And again, it's really key to understand that from the outset because that will help influence the type of exit strategy that you put in place. And my last point there is, again, around ongoing due diligence. I mean, 9 times out of 10, once that contract's been let, unless something happens, we just carry on regardless. But having regular checks, and it could be annually, it could be 6 monthly, it could be monthly on greater contracts around finance, health and safety, what's happening in the market. 9 times out of 10, it's something that you've heard from another contractor that might spark some discussion going on. But I think all these things are really important, especially for those high-value, high-risk contracts to maintain. And it's not just down to procurement to do that. It comes back to bringing those resources together. That virtual team, understanding the roles and responsibilities, some basic measures can be put in place to hopefully highlight some of those concerns. Right, Andrew.
Excellent. That's really insightful and yeah, really excellent session there. We still have about five minutes or so for questions. So still, please do keep your questions coming in. Again, a couple of questions that we've had from the audience. So one is around the tools and methods you've used for the procurement function to retain overall oversight of supplier performance. Again, there is this sense, as you sort of said, of procurement handing over the contract and then having nothing more to do. How have you managed to ensure that it's recognised within the organisation that you need to keep that oversight?
Yeah, of course. So again, it's something that's been driven by our executive team. So this calendar year has basically been around performance. We recognise we haven't got oversight of all of our contracts, so ultimately a dashboard as a starter for 10, and therefore it does tend to be quite reactive when things happen and things get escalated. We have basically an analytics platform called Click, and we have a lot of systems that sit behind it, such as our housing management system, etc., that feed data into the performance dashboard and then provide us with that insight. What we've introduced that sits above that, and we're literally just rolling the actual live data out because we've structured it in a way that it should give us the intelligence we need. We're using our Click dashboard to look at 5 KPIs, which are ultimately consistent across all contracts around time, cost, quality, added value, and social value. And what that looks at is a very simple, almost kind of balanced scorecard rating to say, are they delivering on the quality measures within that contract? So again, coming back to the KPIs, there might be 8 KPIs within a contract based on quality. They can be different for different contracts because it's never going to be the same, but ultimately, are they delivering on that? So you've got the performance management being delivered by the contract manager, and that information is being fed through to my team on a monthly basis. We've split that down into different category areas. So all the contracts are now assigned to a different category, the directorate, and then the dashboard provides that oversight. What we've then tried to do, and this is the way that the reporting's focused, is once we get that information on once a month, and it literally takes 1 minute for each contract manager to do this, is we will then provide a report on all those key contracts that are underperforming. The next step is we've got the oversight groups within each department. That is then to scrutinise why is it those contracts are underperforming. And it might be something that's been aptly dealt with, or it might be something that's just started to happen. The idea behind that is we can then identify whether or not they need support and whether or not that support comes from procurement. It could be a legal issue, it could be a health and safety performance. So as you can see, we're trying to drill down and use our resources to best effect, but it's ultimately driven by that dashboard. And we've got something very similar for risk management as well. We're just introducing basically a new platform that will look at finance, health and safety, data protection. It's based on questionnaires and assessments, but ultimately those departments are responsible for reviewing that. And again, we're starting off with the high risk contracts, and that's going to mirror the performance dashboard.
Okay, that's great. Couple more questions, and again, sort of conscious of time. Yeah, we will try and finish at 12 o'clock. But one of the comments, sort of more of a comment, but again picks up one of the points that you made, Andrew, which is around, again, one of the audiences has said that they had a RAG rating in terms of bronze, silver, gold, and platinum, which gave a good understanding of each individual contract, and contracts would then be managed by different people within the organisation depending upon where it sat within within that RAG rating within the organisation. That prioritization and understanding which are the important ones. Again, I think that's something that you reflected on as well.
That's right. Yeah, that's another really good example of how people can prioritise and focus their resources. It's the biggest impact, and that similar rating system, we've almost kind of got something very similar in terms of high, medium, and low risk.
Yeah. Okay, and then finally, in terms of, or second to last question, do you have SLAs to aid understanding of roles and responsibilities?
Not necessarily. What we do have is we've just introduced a racing matrix. for all procurement to start with, and a lot of that is to provide some clarity on different technical roles across the organisation. So if you think about when we're embarking on a new contract for, let's just say, facilities management or something like that, in the past it's just been an assumption that if they bring certain people in, that's their job role, they'll just go ahead and do it. One of the key issues that we've had is assumptions, and too many of them. So what we've tried to do is identify from the outset what exactly are the skill sets required. So that comes back to that assessment of, we need litigation, we need this. So when we brought the people on, we've had clarity up front. We've then identified those roles and responsibilities all the way through. And as part of what we've called a contract management plan, we've then identified a role for those individuals as and when for managing the contract. What we've not necessarily done in a lot of cases is been too prescriptive around either service level agreements or new practices, procedures, checklists and things like that. We've tried not to introduce too much bureaucracy at the moment, but having that conversation up front and having a simple chart, so to speak, has opened up some clarity and identified those skill sets, which again has helped through that process.
Excellent, thanks very much. And then sort of one very final question from me, Andrew. If there was one thing that you'd like today's audience to take away in terms of your sort of contract management journey, what would it be?
So I would say one of the key things from this is always to be, do one thing really well and then pass that knowledge and learning on. Whereas I know a lot of organisations have tried to do the big picture and said, right, we've got 1,000 contracts, let's embed contract management across them all. They've probably still been doing that 20 years ago. So one of the key things we've said is, let's introduce some better practices and culture and then focus on those top contracts. Get the consistency there, the right people involved and the right shape and how we manage those contracts, and then we'll move on to the rest, because 9 times out of 10, influencing those hard to reach areas will pass on that message and that knowledge, and that's what we're going to be reviewing over the next 12 to 18 months.
Okay, that's fantastic. So again, a big thank you to you, Andrew, for your insights this morning. I thought it was a really excellent session, and we've had some really good feedback. And again, just to let the audience know, we will be placing a recording of this session together with the slides on our website over the next day or so. So hopefully we'll send you out an email notifying you of when you're able to listen again and or view the slides. Again, final thank you to you, the audience, for being here. It was a great turnout, and hope you found it really useful. There will be ongoing Fusion webinars, and again, those who are out and about, we will have our major session at Homes conference in November down in London. So thank you all for attending this morning, and it's probably just good morning, or it may just be good afternoon, but thanks again for coming, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks everyone, take care.